everyone, and welcome back to the Wisdom by Harry YouTube channel. My name is Harry.
And I'm Mary. We're so excited to have you here today for another fascinating episode.
You know how sometimes you think you've got a situation figured out and then bam, something happens that just changes everything?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's kind of what April 2025 felt like with the U.S.-China trade situation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, suddenly both sides are hitting each other with these, frankly staggering 125% tariffs.
Just massive numbers.
Yeah. Feels like only yesterday we were tracking President Trump's earlier tariffs, and now it's a completely different level.
Yeah.
Especially since this time it's really zeroed in on China, while, other trading partners got a pause.
Right. A very specific focus this time.
And we've heard from you, our listeners, loud and clear. You want to get your heads around what this actually means, and quickly.
Absolutely. And this isn't just turning the dial up slightly. This feels more like a potential breaking point. It signals maybe a fundamental rethink on both sides about whether trade at this level is even viable anymore.
So what are we digging into today?
Well, to really unpack this, we've looked at a mix of things. We've got the news reports, the immediate reactions and analysis from different places globally. And we've also got a deeper strategic analysis looking specifically at the economic thinking behind China's moves. The idea is to give everyone listening a clear, insightful, but still, digestible picture of this whole trade fight heating up.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive then is to unpack that April escalation.
Yeah.
We want to get under the hood, figure out what's driving the U.S. and China, look at their strategies, and understand the ripple effects economically and geopolitically.
Exactly. Clarity without the headache.
All right, so let's start with April. This 125% tariff bomb. How did that actually play out?
So it kicked off on April 9th. The U.S., under President Trump, announced this huge hike on tariffs for goods coming in from China. Boom, 125%.
Not exactly subtle.
Not subtle at all. A very significant jump, not a gradual thing.
And China, they didn't just sit back, did they?
No way. Just 2 days later, April 11th, Beijing fires back. They announced their own 125% tariffs on U.S. goods coming into China.
Quick and symmetrical.
Very. Swift and perfectly matched, you could say.
But wait, there was a clarification from the U.S. side too, wasn't there? Something about adding on existing tariffs.
That's right, good point. On April 10th, the day after the initial announcement, the White House clarified something important.
Sure.
They pointed out that this new 125% was on top of an existing 20% tariff related to fentanyl smuggling concerns.
Ah, okay. So the math changes.
It does. Suddenly, the total potential tariff burden on some Chinese goods hits 145%, and the White House also added that this was like a minimum. Other tariffs could potentially still apply on top of that.
Wow, 145% or even more potentially.
Yeah.
So China faces that, responds with 125%, but then they said something about drawing a line, right? Not just endlessly matching hike for hike.
Exactly. That was a really significant statement. China basically announced they wouldn't automatically match any further U.S. tariff increases.
And their reason.
Pretty blunt, actually. They said at these kinds of levels, the basic economics of trading between the two just don't work anymore. It really signaled they saw this as a point where viable trade under these conditions was breaking down.
That feels like a major change in tone compared to maybe earlier rounds, like saying, okay, this game isn't worth playing anymore.
It does, but then you also had these other messages coming out.
Yeah.
The foreign spokesperson, for instance, was saying China is ready to fight to the end if the U.S. keeps pushing.
Okay, so tough talk.
But in the same breath, they were also calling for dialogue, for talks to find a way out.
That sounds complicated. Fight to the end, but also let's talk.
It really shows the tightrope they're walking, doesn't it? On one hand, project strength, resolve. On the other, acknowledge that these tariffs, well, they're going to cause serious pain on both sides of the Pacific. It's a balancing act.
Okay, so that's the immediate blow-by-blow in April. But something else really struck me from the analysis when we looked at this idea that China's entire approach feels different this time around compared to the first trade war a few years back.
Yes, that's a critical point. You really notice a shift. Back then, you saw more signs, I think, of Beijing looking for off-ramps, willing to negotiate to de-escalate.
Yeah.
This time, the language, the actions, it feels much more dug in, defiant. There's this never yield feeling that seems much stronger now.
So less about finding a deal, more about standing their ground.
Exactly. It feels less tactical, more like a fundamental recalculation on their part about their own economic position, their leverage, and maybe a greater willingness to absorb some pain now for what they see as longer-term strategic gains.
And what's driving that change? Why are they seemingly more prepared or maybe just more willing to stand firm this time?
Well, there are a few key factors. One big one is simply that the U.S. market, while still important, isn't as overwhelmingly crucial for China's exports as it used to be.
How much has that changed?
Quite a bit. If you look back at 2018, nearly 20%, 1/5 of China's exports went to the U.S. Fast forward to 2023, and that number had dropped below 13%.
Okay, still significant, but definitely less dependent.
Exactly. That gives them more breathing room, more flexibility when facing U.S. trade pressure. If your biggest customer is becoming slightly less big, you maybe feel less pressure to cave to their demands.
Makes sense. And there was also mention of their domestic demand expansion strategy. How does that fit in?
Right. That's about China trying to boost its own internal market, getting their own consumers to spend more, strengthening their domestic economy.
So they're less reliant on selling stuff overseas.
That's the goal, to build up this internal engine for growth. So they're less vulnerable to, shifts in global demand or, like now, trade wars. These U.S. tariffs could even, paradoxically, push them to accelerate that internal focus.
Now, here's something that sounded a bit counterintuitive. One analysis suggested that China's recent economic slowdown, all the talk about real estate problems, capital flight decoupling, might actually make them more resilient to these tariff shocks. How does that work?
Yeah, it does seem backwards at first glance, but the thinking goes something like this. Because they've already been dealing with slower growth with these headwinds for a while.
They're already kind of braced for impact.
Kind of. Businesses, policymakers, they've already had to become more adaptable, more prepared for a tougher economic climate. They've been navigating choppier waters already. So while these tariffs will definitely hurt, the argument is they might be better positioned to absorb the shock than if this had hit during a period of, say, super fast, smooth sailing growth.
So they've already tightened their belts a bit, maybe learned to operate in a less certain environment.
That's the idea. And there's another angle too, the domestic politics.
Ah, right. Could these tariffs actually help the government rally support at home?
Absolutely. It's a classic move, isn't it? You have an external adversary, someone imposing pain from the outside. It provides a very convenient scapegoat for any economic difficulties the country might be facing.
Distract from internal problems.
Potentially, yes. The government can frame these U.S. actions as aggressive as trying to hold China down. That can stir up nationalist sentiment, direct public frustration outwards rather than inwards. And we did see some signs of that, reports of patriotic posts online, some businesses making pro-China statements.
And those Mao quotes starting to circulate again.
Right. That definitely signals a sort of circle the wagons, almost wartime footing mentality.
Okay, but even with China exporting proportionally less directly to the U.S., one source really emphasized that the U.S. is still deeply tangled up in Chinese supply chains. Just maybe less obviously now.
That's a really crucial distinction. Direct imports of finished goods might be down, but that doesn't mean the dependency is gone. Far from it.
How so?
Well, many goods the U.S. now imports from, say, Vietnam or Mexico might still rely heavily on components, parts, or raw materials that originated in China.
So the label might change, but China's still in the mix further down the chain.
Precisely. China is just so deeply embedded in global manufacturing. Untangling that is incredibly complex. One figure was striking. Back in 2022, the U.S. still relied on China for something like 532 key product categories.
Wow.
And that number was nearly 4 times higher than it was in the year 2000. So this idea of a quick, clean decoupling, it's proving much, much harder in reality.
So pulling these economies apart is a massive long-term project if it happens at all. And it sounds like China might be calculating that these high tariffs will eventually bite hard enough in the U.S.
Hurt American consumers.
Yeah, that might even trigger a recession here.
That seems to be a significant part of their thinking. Beijing likely expects these tariffs to show up as higher prices on shelves in the U.S. That could create consumer discontent, maybe put political pressure on the U.S. administration.
Squeeze the average American voter.
Right. And they probably believe that this economic pain could force the U.S. government to rethink the tariffs and maybe even contribute to a wider economic slowdown or downturn in the States. It's a gamble, but it's part of their calculation.
Okay, so China feels it has some cards to play, feels maybe more resilient than before, and they have their own specific levers they can pull, right? Beyond just matching tariffs. That point about rare earths really stood out.
Ooh, that's a huge one. China has overwhelming dominance in the processing and supply of rare earth elements. Something like 72% of U.S. imports?
And these are critical for, well, almost everything tech-related.
Exactly. Smartphones, EVs, wind turbines, but also advanced military hardware. defense applications, and China hasn't been shy about signaling this leverage.
How so?
Well, back in March and April, right around this escalation, they placed several U.S. entities, including defense contractors, tech firms known to rely on these materials, onto their own export control list.
Woof. That's a direct shot. Cutting off supply.
It's a clear warning, at the very least. It could cause serious disruptions for U.S. manufacturing, even impact national security supply chains. It's a powerful card to hold.
And it's not just the high-tech stuff either. Agriculture is another area where China can exert pressure. And that often has, let's say, outsized political effects here in the U.S.
Precisely. Think about soybeans. China buys roughly half of all U.S. soybean exports. That's enormous leverage.
And poultry too, right?
Yep, nearly 10% of U.S. poultry exports go to China. And again, we saw action there. Back in March, China revoked import approvals for some U.S. soybean exporters.
A warning shot across the bow for the agricultural sector.
Absolutely. And importantly, these agricultural sectors often have strong political voices and are concentrated in electorally significant states. So hitting agriculture isn't just economic, it's potentially political too.
Then you have the big American tech giants, Apple, Tesla, companies like that who are just so deeply intertwined with manufacturing in China. They must be caught right in the middle of this.
Oh, absolutely. They have huge investments, massive operations, complex supply chains, all centered in or heavily reliant on China. These tariffs directly impact their costs, their profit margins.
And Beijing knows this gives them leverage.
You have to assume so. It's another pressure point on the U.S. administration via corporate America. There were also suggestions they might use non-tariff barriers, regulatory hurdles, inspections, that sort of thing, against these companies operating within China.
And someone like Elon Musk, with Tesla's huge Shanghai factory,
Brad.
he becomes a sort of potential wedge.
Potentially, yes. His massive interests in China, combined with his sometimes independent stance on U.S. policy, could be seen by Beijing as an area to exploit, perhaps driving a wedge between parts of the U.S. business community and the administration's hard line.
It really sounds like China isn't just playing defense here. They seem to be viewing these U.S. actions, these tariffs, almost as a strategic opening, a chance to maybe shift the global balance a bit.
I think it's a very important strategic layer to this. When the U.S. imposes broad tariffs, not just on China, but potentially hitting allies too, Beijing likely sees an opportunity.
An opportunity to what? Challenge U.S. leadership.
Potentially, yes.
Yep.
By creating friction between the U.S. and its traditional partners, China can try to present itself as the more stable, predictable, reliable economic partner on the world stage.
And are we seeing signs of that playing out? Like in East Asia with Japan and South Korea.
It certainly looks that way. Think about it. China, Japan, and South Korea held their first high-level economic talks in 5 years, right after this tariff escalation. And they explicitly committed to speeding up talks on a three-way free trade agreement.
That's significant, given the U.S. alliances with Japan and South Korea.
Very significant. These are key U.S. allies in the region. If they start moving towards closer economic integration with China, partly in response to U.S. trade policy uncertainty, that has major geopolitical implications.
And it's not just Northeast Asia. Southeast Asia seems to be another focus for China.
Definitely. Xi Jinping had planned visits to Vietnam, Malaysia, Cambodia notably, all countries that had faced those paused U.S. tariffs.
Interesting timing.
Right. It underscores China's push to deepen ties, economically and politically, in Southeast Asia. These nations, having felt the threat of U.S. tariffs themselves, might find aligning more closely with China a more attractive or at least more stable option moving forward.
What about Europe? The EU often tries to tread its own path, but are they siding with China against these U.S. tariffs?
Well, the EU-China relationship is complex, lots of friction points there too, but on this specific issue of U.S. trade protectionism, we have seen some notable convergence.
Like what?
High-level EU officials and Chinese counterparts have jointly condemned U.S. protectionism. There have been talks about strengthening their own trade ties, even discussing a full EU-China summit. It suggests at least a potential crack in a united Western front on trade.
And all these tariffs flying around, the uncertainty, could that actually start to chip away at the dominance of the U.S. dollar globally?
That's a longer-term question, but yes, it's a potential consequence. Widespread tariffs create instability, uncertainty, that can, over time, reduce confidence in the currency of the country imposing them. The U.S. dollar, U.S. Treasury bonds, traditionally seen as the ultimate safe assets, might face more questions if these trade disputes keep rattling the global economic system.
This all seems to tie back to that broader strategy we keep hearing about from China, dual circulation. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure, dual circulation is really central to understanding China's long-term economic game plan right now. It's fundamentally about making their economy more resilient and more balanced.
Now, by doing what?
Two main things, hence the dual. First, reducing their over-reliance on foreign trade, especially exports, as the main driver of growth. Second, simultaneously improving the quality and diversity of their international trade.
So less dependence overall, but better, more spread out trade relationships.
Exactly. It's like building two engines for the economy. A stronger internal domestic engine, that's the first circulation, and a more diversified, robust international engine, the second circulation. The key is not being overly reliant on any single market like the US or the EU used to be for them.
And we're seeing that diversification happen in practice, like with the Belt and Road countries.
Yes, absolutely. Trade between China and the countries involved in its Belt and Road Initiative has grown significantly. Same with the ASEAN nations in Southeast Asia.
To the point where they're bigger partners than the US or EU now.
That's right. Trade with ASEAN and the BRI countries combined now surpasses China's trade with both the EU and the US. That gives them enormous strategic flexibility when facing pressure from the West. They've also worked hard to diversify where they get crucial imports from oil, gas, grains from Russia, key minerals from Africa and elsewhere. Less reliance on single suppliers.
Okay, so that's the external part. What about the internal circulation? Boosting their own domestic market.
That's the other critical piece. It's about shifting the economy's balance away from just building stuff, infrastructure, factories, and towards getting Chinese people to spend more, boosting private consumption, growing the services sector.
And how's that going?
It remains a major long-term goal. Progress has maybe been a bit slower than hoped, partly due to the pandemic and other economic challenges they faced recently, but the strategic direction towards strengthening that domestic pillar is very clear.
You know, underneath all this economic strategy and the tariff numbers, there seems to be this really powerful historical context driving China's determination.
Absolutely. You really can't understand their current posture without appreciating that historical dimension. This never yield attitude isn't just rhetoric, it's deeply connected to avoiding what they see as a repeat of the 19th century.
This century of humiliation.
Exactly. That period of being carved up and exploited by Western powers. That memory is incredibly potent and shapes their entire approach to dealing with the West today, especially the US. They are determined not to be seen as weak or easily pushed around again.
And they feel they now have the economic muscle to back that up.
They certainly believe they do. Their role as this indispensable global supplier for so many vital goods, chemicals, minerals, key components like computer chips, where they supply around 60% of U.S. needs.
And those rare earths we talked about.
And rare earths, yes. That gives them significant leverage they simply didn't have decades ago.
It really brings home the significance of seeing those Mao Zedong quotes pop up again on social media over there. That's a powerful symbol of digging in for a struggle.
It really is. It signals a national mood, a readiness for hardship if necessary. And then you had those reports about foreign affairs and commerce officials being told to cancel vacations, stay on call 24/7.
Wow. All hands on deck.
It underlines just how seriously Beijing is taking this. And they're not just reacting defensively, they're actively trying to build an international coalition against the U.S. tariffs, reaching out to European countries, Japan, South Korea, even proposing joint statements at places like the G20. It's a multi-pronged strategic response.
Okay, so pulling this all together for our listener, after this deep dive, what are the absolute key takeaways from this whole April 2025 escalation?
Well, first, I'd say the sheer speed and scale of the tariff hikes in April, that 125%, potentially 145%, that marks a really dramatic turning point. It's not business as usual.
Right.
Second, China's response. It's defined by this real determination, this never yield stance. And that's backed by real factors. They're changing economic structure, those strategic advantages like rare earths, and this deep historical resolve.
Okay, what else?
Third, the global ripple effects. This isn't just U.S.-China. It has the potential to seriously reshuffle global alliances, maybe pulling some nations closer into China's orbit and straining U.S. relationships.
And if finally,
just recognizing how much China's position and its strategy have evolved. This isn't just a replay of the first trade war. They feel they're in a different, perhaps stronger position now.
and looking ahead, what are the big questions this leaves us with? What should we be watching or thinking about?
Several huge questions, really. I mean, first, will this actually lead to a real substantial decoupling of the world's two largest economies? Or will they find ways to remain intertwined despite the conflict?
Yeah, the $64,000 question, or maybe trillion-dollar question.
Exactly. Second, how will global supply chains continue to twist and turn? We've seen shifts already, but how will businesses adapt to this level of sustained pressure and uncertainty?
And the political map?
Right. What are the long-term impacts on international alliances? Does this accelerate a move towards a more multipolar world, or does the U.S. manage to rally its partners? It would definitely be worth digging deeper into that dual circulation strategy for anyone interested, and also maybe looking back at the longer history of U.S.-China trade to get even more context.
So as we watch this high-stakes economic fight play out, you really do have to wonder, is this more than just another trade dispute? Could this be one of those moments that historians look back on as a fundamental shift, a point where the rules of the global economic game were truly rewritten right before our eyes?
It certainly feels like a possibility.
Well, definitely plenty to keep watching. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.